Brace yourself.
WarioWare Mega Microgames is one of those games that's defined by a cultural zeitgeist. In 2003, we were starting to see the online world grow. It wasn't just about magazines and television anymore, it was about the budding ecosystem of internet publishing, Web 2.0, and the viral nature that social media was beginning to cultivate under. We were beginning to see the indecisive channel surfing mentality of the 80s and 90s develop into full-on attention deficit disorder. And the frantic barrage of information that teenagers were being exposed to during that time was starting to define the era's identity. WarioWare encapsulated this generation's growing impatience, our intolerance of the slow burn. We wanted our fun now, delivered to us as quickly and as digestibly as possible. But I think that beneath the avalanche of 5-second video game bursts and batshit insane subject matter hides a confidence, a resolute desire to fundamentalize games. It seemed like information overload, but when I think about this series, I see something more, something much more. So here's today's thesis. WarioWare expresses prowess in the fundamentals of video game design through the microgame concept, displaying the key components of intuitive and player-friendly game design in a pure and concentrated form. WarioWare starts with the titular anti-hero playing video games in his home, only to discover that game sales are on the rise. No slouch when it comes to greed, Wario decides to hop on the gravy train that is the video game business and opens up WarioWare Inc., his own game development studio. But making games is hard, and Wario isn't someone who overexerts himself if he can avoid it, so he calls in a ragtag group of characters to create games for his studio. Wario's impulsive penchant for greed is expressed through the kinds of games he and his crew make. Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the idea of mini-games as seen in games like Mario Party. They're short and bite-sized, but when combined into a collective, they produce diversity. And when surrounding a major game mode, they sort of create their own little space in the gaming ecosystem. WarioWare takes that design mentality and goes one step further: microgames. Wario isn't a programmer, so he's not someone who can make the next AAA blockbuster. Instead, he invests in microgames. They're brief, lasting only a few seconds, and normally require only a couple of button presses to complete. Now you're probably already thinking, how can games that short and simple be a prime example of video game design? Well, the easiest way to explain this is to show you one of the microgames in action, and I can dissect it piece by piece. Let's start with one of the earlier microgames, Crazy Cars, where Wario must jump over an oncoming object. The microgame begins with a single command, dodge. The object veers toward Wario and the player must use the A button for the jump command in time. If the player is too early or too late, the object hits Wario and the player fails the microgame. The timer is also placed at the bottom of the screen. If it reaches 0, the player also fails. Fortunately, that variable of time is not applicable in this example, because if the player takes too much time to jump, Wario is hit and the player fails anyway. The time limit doesn't impact the success-failure for this particular microgame, which is convenient for the sake of this analysis. So let's go bit by bit. First, the command, dodge. What that single word does is display player objective, which is, as I stated in my previous video on the vanishing of Ethan Carter, a fundamental property of games. The command tells the player what they must do to succeed in this game, which is to dodge the incoming hazard. It's quick and to the point, so the player isn't hampered down in the quick pace, but it's also descriptive enough to give the player an idea of what kind of challenge they're completing. It's an intuitive implication of something that must be nimbly avoided, one that doesn't linger and break the pace. Naturally phrased, it fits extremely well with the brevity of WarioWare's microgames. Second, there's the controls. WarioWare has always been a jack-of-all-trades when it comes to the systems it's appeared on. Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, Wii, Wii U, and even some downloadable versions have all been released. This means that the WarioWare series has had many options in taking advantage of different control setups. Still, with all this in mind, it's the simplicity of the Game Boy Advance that perfectly articulates why these microgames work so well. With only a D-pad, 2 buttons, and some shoulder buttons, the GBA simplifies the setup perfectly. Limiting the number of input methods makes it easier for the player to narrow down what can be used to input a command. While I like the DS touchscreen and the Wii Remote, both aren't as instinctive and simple as the purity of the GBA button layout. The Wii even has to tell the player the certain way the Wii Remote must be held, which breaks the pace and shows that the Wii's control setup isn't as simple and intuitive as the GBA's. But back to the microgame. In this same microgame, the player must press a button to jump over the hazard at the right time. It's a single command that must be input quickly. One press of the A button and Wario jumps. But think about just how simple this input is. Think about if this input required 2 buttons simultaneously, or even required moving around with the D-pad prior to pressing the button. It's something that's too complex for such a brief and impulsive game like Crazy Cars. What the microgame has to do is intuitively convey how the player must accomplish the objective, dodging the hazard. There can't be any time for the player to ponder what does what in regards to the controls. A single button press is all that's required here, and this microgame does an astoundingly good job at providing this intuitive gameplay. WarioWare's microgames master this kind of design where nothing is complicated enough to break the fast pace. Everything you do in a microgame is, or should be, totally native to the player's precognitions. Everything should feel natural. So in this regard, the player instantly knows what the objective in the game is and also how the mechanics of the microgame function. Press a button to jump, jump to dodge the hazard to complete the game. So let's look at another, slightly more complex example. Later in the game, you meet Mona, who is in a rush to get to her job on time. While driving her motorcycle fast on the road, she starts a large police chase. One of the microgames in Mona's segment is the following. This is nighttime allergies, and yeah, you're supposed to sniff the snot back into an anime lady's nose. It's silly, and that's admittedly one reason why I chose to discuss it here, but I think it's also just complex enough to be worth a detailed look. The command displayed is sniff, which already is a bit more ambiguous than dodge. We don't know what we're sniffing or how, so the player isn't given as much concrete information for an intuitive digestion of the microgame's mechanics. Still, the main gist is to press a button repeatedly to sniff the snot back into the nose, which is a relatively simple setup. Similarly, the controls aren't as intuitive, since you press a button to sniff, though there is the implication that you're sniffing it up the nostril, so you might consider pressing up on the D-pad to be the command, but that's not the case, you must press the A button. That's something that I think some of the less successful microgames suffer from as well. Making the controls identifiable so quickly means that visual design can be just as important as technical design. And that small bit of artistic confusion can mean the difference between a player succeeding or failing the game. WarioWare requires that its individual microgames be intuitive for the player to understand, both in how they work, such as objective, and in how the commands are input. Admittedly, I think Nighttime Allergies doesn't really do that right, and I think it can be just as much a lesson in bad microgame design as good. For what it's worth, it's a parallel worth noting. Additionally, Nighttime Allergies uses the timer as a mechanic. In the previous microgame I mentioned, time wasn't an issue, since the decision of whether you succeeded or failed was always determined before the timer expired. You either jumped and dodged the vehicle, or you didn't and you failed the game. This second microgame, on the other hand, is impacted by the timer. If you don't sniff the snot completely before the timer reaches 0, it's counted as a failure. Many microgames in WarioWare have the timer as a mechanic, so it quickly becomes a new variable the player must compensate for. Nighttime Allergies is also a very memorable microgame based on its weird subject matter, which also benefits the microgame format. Despite aesthetics running the risk of confusing controls, identifiable artistry makes the game design even easier to remember, while also diversifying it from other microgames. That quirky art style and gross concept are hypnotically silly, a great way to keep it in the player's minds between dozens of other microgames. This is a consistent element of many, many other games in WarioWare, giving both the individual and the collective microgames personality to spare. But WarioWare's main gimmick isn't the individual microgames, it's the collective of them. The player is required to complete these microgames in quick succession of each other, a rapid-fire barrage of challenges that each last mere seconds. The player must be able to successfully interpret the microgame's objective, determine how to input a command using the controls, and then input the command under the proper conditions to succeed. all in a matter of seconds. This kind of brief, immediate game design must be intuitive. It must display all of these elements to the player without layers and layers of explanation. That's not easy to do, especially once the pace of the microgames increases to higher speeds, and the player is given even less time to process things. Limiting explanation in a video game and making all of these elements immediately decipherable to the player is something that takes a considerable amount of skill. Think about Journey and how the main destination is always in view, signifying where the player must go without bombarding them with text, waypoints, or maps. WarioWare, in its own way, does the same thing. It gives the player the bare essentials of what each microgame contains, but in doing so, it condenses these facts into something that can be instantly understood, processed, and input. Everything is displayed in the gameplay, and all within seconds. Even better, these games introduce additional elements that can provide increased difficulty. For example, Crazy Cars has the incoming vehicles occasionally jump over Wario, faking the player out and forcing the player to be in more control of the reflexes. Other games have more things that need to be collected or more hazards to avoid than the original form of the microgame. So the games do have other variables that can be changed to increase the difficulty. They're still complex enough that the player isn't playing the same identical game twice in later stages. And in having the ability to become harder, they feel more fleshed out than a single incarnation can display. Challenge can culminate, and the basic elements of the microgames can evolve with the player's skill. When it all comes together, players of WarioWare Mega Microgames are bombarded with bizarre little challenges, all thrown at them one after the other in a matter of minutes. It can feel like a caffeine headache, but each microgame is self-contained. Every bit of information they show is totally native to the gameplay, from the objective to the controls, to even the obstacles the player must overcome. The player is shown a situation, understands what must be done, inputs the required command under the right conditions, and completes the game, all within seconds and usually without even fully understanding what they just did. When the path is that intuitive to the player that quickly, that shows quality game design. That shows inherent proficiency at leading the player organically and without artificial signposts, something that even Mario Party, the arguable king of minigame collections, couldn't do without detailed explanations. As trippy and surreal as WarioWare is, it's also a strong display of the basics of organic game design. When it comes to giving the player all they need to know to complete a challenge without a tutorial or paragraph in sight, WarioWare is so intelligently concentrated in these fundamentals that I'm astonished that it isn't discussed more when it comes to how to design a game. Sure, most games are infinitely more complex than a single screen or button press, but I think its display of the fundamentals is something any 101 class in game design should look at. If anything, it'll add a little bit of weirdness to your classroom.